Friends, our scripture lesson today is taken from the book of Acts, chapter 9, verses 1 through 20. Meanwhile, Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any who belonged to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now, as he was going along and approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" He asked, "Who are you, Lord?" The reply came, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." The men who were traveling with him stood speechless because they heard the voice but saw no one. Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. For 3 days he was without sight, and neither ate nor drank. Now there was a disciple in Damascus named Ananias. The Lord said to him in a vision, "Ananias." He answered, "Here I am, Lord." The Lord said to him, "Get up and go to the street called Straight, and at the house of Judas look for a man of Tarsus named Saul. At this moment he is praying, and he has seen in a vision a man named Ananias come in and lay his hands on him so that he might regain his sight." But Ananias answered, "Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much evil he has done to your saints in Jerusalem. And here he has authority from the chief priests to bind all who invoke your name." But the Lord said to him, "Go, for he is an instrument whom I have chosen to bring my name before Gentiles and kings and before the people of Israel. I myself will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name." So Ananias went and entered the house. He laid his hands on Saul and said, "Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on your way here, has sent me so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit." And immediately something like scales fell from his eyes, and his sight was restored. Then he got up and was baptized, and after taking some food, he regained his strength. For several days he was with the disciples in Damascus, and immediately he began to proclaim Jesus in the synagogues, saying, "He is the Son of God." Well, friends, we are starting a 4-week series that I'm calling Launch. And so we're going to be 4 weeks in these stories from the book of Acts, which is fully known as Acts of the Apostles. Okay, and the Acts of the Apostles chronicles the start of the early church after the resurrection of Christ. So Jesus is crucified, he's resurrected, he ascends to heaven, and then the church begins. And so what the apostles did to create the church, I think, has a lot of inspiration for us in terms of whether we are starting up something in our lives or starting over something in our lives. We get a lot of lessons from what happens at the start of the church. Now, the story we have today is this story of this man named Saul, who will later be known as the Apostle Paul, the great evangelist. But at this point, he has been involved in the persecution of Christians. Immediately before this story in the book of Acts, Stephen was stoned to death. And Saul was there. Saul consented to it. He totally approved of this. And because of these persecutions, because of the stonings that were happening to the disciples were scattering. And so the church was scattering, but not because there was a plan. The church was scattering because they were being persecuted. So it kind of reminds me of whoever happens to be playing quarterback for the Chicago Bears. He ends up running for his life, occasionally makes a good play out of it, but actually just spends most of his time running for his life. Okay, and actually, those of you who are Jets or Giants fans can commiserate with that. All right, but this is really what the church is like at this point. They're spreading the gospel, but entirely because they are on the run. And so this person, Saul, he is struck blind, and God comes to him, and says, "Saul, why do you persecute me?" And he says, "Who are you?" All right? And he says, "I'm Jesus, whom you are persecuting." And so God confronts Saul directly and says, "You are persecuting me." Saul is being confronted with his error. He's being confronted with what he has done directly by God in a demonstration of power that strikes him blind. Now, Jesus then goes to this disciple named Ananias and says, I have a job for you, Ananias. I need you to go see this guy, Saul. Ananias thinks this is not a great idea. Okay, so Ananias has heard about this man. See, so God comes to Ananias, and it's in a dream. Remember, most of these communications were not happening, in the flesh. It's happening in a dream. And I always thought that was kind of interesting because I would personally tend to question dreams that I have. I would just tend to think, really no more spicy food before bed. But he has a dream, he believes, and he responds in the dream to God saying, Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much evil he has done to your saints in Jerusalem. This is very polite language for, are you crazy? I've heard about this guy. He just killed one of ours. He's thinking about who this person is, what this person has done. And it's very rational to think this. It's very rational to look at him and say, look at what this person is capable of doing. But here's the thing. God also asks that question. Look at what this person is capable of doing, except God looks at this question from a different perspective. And God says, go, for he is an instrument whom I have chosen to bring my name before Gentiles. One of my favorite preachers is Andy Stanley. I'll be heading off to listen to him at a conference this week. But Andy likes to riff on this story, and I love the way he riffs on it. He muses a hypothetical conversation in heaven between Jesus and the angels, and where one of the angels comes to Jesus and said, "Hey, Jesus, your church is off to an awful start. They're getting killed." And Jesus goes, I've got an idea. How about this guy Saul? I'm going to use this guy Saul. And the angel is like, what? He's killing us, literally. And Jesus goes, yeah, he's a real go-getter. We need one of those. We need a go-getter, and the angel goes like, yeah, he's go-getting us, but what God sees is the potential in him that is beyond his past, beyond the mistakes of his past. And God sees your potential beyond your mistakes. What if we always looked for what people are capable of from that angle? What are they capable of in a good way? What would happen if the qualities they possess that may be applied in a bad way could be redirected toward good? I mean, we've often said this, right? When we see a really inventive criminal scheme and someone says, man, if only they applied that creativity, that ingenuity, even that brashness towards something good. But actually, isn't that what our prison system and stuff should be? Isn't that what it's supposed to be about? It's supposed to be sitting there saying, well, what if? What if we could take these energies that some people have and put in a bad direction and actually figure out a way to redirect it toward good? And this is one of the things that faith should be doing in people's lives. When we take faith into a person's life, it should be helping you unleash the energies that you have that may have been directed not in the best possible way, and then direct it toward the things of God. Faith should help you take the same energy that many people put toward acquiring power or acquiring goods, acquiring things for themselves, and turn those same energies into forces of selflessness in the world. This is faith doing what it ought to do in our lives. Saul turns around. It says he immediately began to proclaim Jesus in the synagogues, and I really wonder for him, what did this feel like? What did it feel like? I mean, can you imagine? I mean, his identity had been so wrapped up in what he had been doing. It's hard to turn around like that. It's really difficult. I can only imagine the number of people who went up to him and said, hey, wait a second, I think I know you. weren't you just persecuting? Weren't you just preaching the exact opposite of what you're saying now? It's really hard to turn on a dime. By the way, in this age of social media, it's impossible because they will dig up that tweet of yours from 12 years ago that says the exact opposite of what you're saying now. So it would have been embarrassing. He would have had to admit that he had been wrong. And yet there is such incredible power in admitting that we're wrong, and there is a great way of thinking about it. What I love is this quote from this Nobel laureate, Daniel Kahneman. If you've ever read his books are great. But there's a great quote of his where he talks about being wrong, and what he says is this. He says, "No one enjoys being wrong, but I do enjoy having been wrong because it means I am now less wrong than I was before." Isn't that awesome? I mean, he's a Nobel laureate, okay, so he's kind of used to being right. But he enjoys being proven wrong, all right? It's a wonderful mindset shift if you can sit there and wrap your head around the idea that every time I'm proven wrong, I'm actually better because I'm less wrong than I was before. In fact, if we track these things, it can give us a roadmap toward improvement. There's an author and a professor, she teaches at Stanford, her name is Tina Seelig, and about 12 years ago, she wrote this book called What I Wish I Knew When I Was 20. And I actually think a story from that book is going to make next week's message because there's a great lesson in it for what I want to talk about in week 2 of this series. But she says, "I require my students to craft a resume that summarizes all their biggest failures." I mean, right? We don't do that, right? Your resume is your good stuff, okay? In fact, one of the key things, right, is often you see a resume and there's like a time gap, and you're like, what happened in there? Right? And I think it's a big mistake when people leave out the failure. You try to hide it. First of all, people can see it, but it's important. But she says, "I require my students to craft a resume that summarizes all their biggest failures, personal, professional, and academic. For every failure, each student must describe what he or she learned from that experience." What an amazing thing it would be if we crafted a failure resume. She says that a lot of her students actually keep the failure resume going. They review it periodically, and they add to it. All right? Because every failure makes you better if you admit it and if you learn from it. See, one of the lessons that we need to remember is that learners are more valuable than experts. Learners are more valuable than experts because they're continually getting better. How many of us have met an expert who has stopped learning? They're only useful for a very limited period of time. And as things move faster, that period of time is shorter and shorter and shorter. In order for an expert to stay an expert, they have to continue to learn. Learners are evergreen. Learners always have upside. Learners are always getting better, and they're getting better by realizing that they have been wrong. There's a business executive named Ray Dalio, and I also enjoy this quote of his about this. He says, "If you don't look back at yourself and think, 'Wow, how stupid I was a year ago,' then you must not have learned much in the last year." You should be able to think, how stupid was I? How stupid was I a year ago? How stupid was I 5 years ago? All right? By the way, you don't have to answer that for me. But we're always learning. That's why I kind of love those posts that you see on social media where a person says, "I was today years old when I learned." I love that. There's so many things, It isn't long between I have those moments of I was today years old when I finally learned that this is how something works. This is how it's supposed to be. And then you learn that and you go, how stupid I was to not have seen that, to not have noticed it, to not have understood it. And yet each one of those things can be looked at as I am better because of it. Not to look at these things that you've learned with a sense of guilt. You were wrong, fine, you were wrong. But if you were wrong and you learned from it, you don't take guilt going forward, you take progress going forward. I even look at Paul in his own life coming to grips with this. Here's a little thing that he says in his first letter to the Corinthians. He still writes this, he's still carrying the guilt of his past with him. And he says, "For I am the least of the apostles, unfit to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God." He still was carrying the pain of having done it. Because, it's very sterile when you read these accounts. But when it says that he was present and consented to the stoning of Stephen, I can't even, it's traumatic to even think about what it would have been like to be there. What would it be like to witness something like this? What would it be like to consent to something like this? What would it be like to encourage something like this? It's so barbaric. It's difficult for me to get my mind around it, and I'm not even sure I want to get my mind around it. It's not the kind of thing I want rattling around inside my brain. But you can imagine that it was difficult for him to come to grips with this from his past, and yet it didn't stop him. But what I love is that his letter to the Philippians, which is written, scholars believe, anywhere from 5 to 10 years after he wrote 1 Corinthians, he seems to have evolved in his thinking. And he says this, which I think is so important for us to remember. He writes in Philippians 3, chapter 3, verse 13, "Forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead, I press on toward the goal." I think this is some of the healing that came over time. He was able to let go of some of the guilt of what he had done. And instead he was able to say, forgetting what lies behind, straining forward to what lies ahead, I'm pressing on. And what if this was our attitude all the time? What if we always said that we are going to press on toward the goal because we're going to look at all the mistakes that we've made as teaching moments? That it's all educational, it's preparation. What if every one of these "how stupid was I" moments is actually "how much smarter am I now"? And then we come to understand that our past is a launching pad to the future. It's not a disqualifier. And the thing about this is that we not only need to apply this to ourselves, we need to make sure we apply this to other people. See, it's one thing for us to be able to say, yes, the mistakes of my past are learning experiences that are a launching pad into my future. But where we really make the world a better place is if we can see this in other people. Is if for every, because remember, that's really at the crux of the scriptures, right? We've got to treat others the way we want to be treated. So we've got to give others the same grace and forgiveness that we would want shown to ourselves. That if we want others to see that the mistakes that we made in our past were learning experiences, that we are now better, that we are now smarter for having had them, then we need to do that for others. And what would our world be like if, for everyone we met, we looked at their failures and simply were able to ask a question? Well, did you learn? What did you learn from it? How much better are you because you've had that failure, confronted that failure, learned from that failure. If we ignore our failures, if we deny our failures, if we decide that we're going to leave a mysterious gap in our resume because we don't want to mention that job that didn't work out, because we don't want to mention that thing that didn't happen, then we are really robbing ourselves and the world of the value of the learning that's possible. There's so much lost potential in denying the failures that we've had. There's so much lost potential in not allowing other people to grow and learn and move forward from their failures. So I encourage you, as we talk about this concept of launching ourselves forward, maybe try that exercise. Write a failure resume. Chronicle your biggest personal, professional, academic failures. And ask yourself, how did I learn from these? How am I better? Really sit down and ask yourself, how stupid I was a year ago, 5 years ago, and how much better am I as a result? Because that will start to lead us to understand how much better we can be than we have been before. And next week, in week 2 of launch, we're going to talk about this concept of expanding our own understanding of potential as seen through the eyes of the apostles who took the church further than they ever thought they'd be able to take it. Amen.